The 6-year-old boy sits in the back of his father's car, watching Ohio farmland blur past the window. It's 1936, the Great Depression still has the country by the throat. But Stephen Armstrong has saved enough to take his son to the Cleveland air races, and the child in the back seat doesn't know yet that his life just changed direction. The boy's nose presses against the glass, breath fogging the window as they pass endless fields of corn and wheat. His father, normally a man of few words, has been talking about this trip for weeks. Every dollar set aside, every penny counted twice. In these years, taking your son to an air show isn't just a leisure activity, it's a statement of faith. Faith that there's still wonder left in a world that's been beaten down by economic collapse. Young Neil doesn't understand the sacrifice yet. He just knows they're going to see airplanes. Real ones, not the models he builds in his room from balsa wood and glue, not the pictures in the aviation magazines he studies like scripture. Actual flying machines, with pilots who look death in the face and laugh. The Cleveland air races sprawl across the municipal airport like a carnival of the impossible. Thousands of people mill around, their faces turned skyward. The smell of engine oil and hot metal hangs in the air. Vendors sell peanuts and lemonade, and overhead the planes perform miracles. They bank and dive. They loop and roll. The engines scream loud enough to feel in your chest. And when his father tells him they're going up, that they're actually going to fly, Neil Armstrong's 6-year-old heart nearly stops. The plane rises. It's a Ford trimotor, all corrugated metal and noise. The boy presses his face against the window. Below him, the world shrinks. Roads become lines. Houses become toys, and something fundamental shifts in Neil Armstrong's understanding of what a human being can do. The flight lasts maybe 15 minutes, but in those 15 minutes, gravity loses its authority. The Earth, which had always been the immovable foundation of everything, becomes just another surface. One you can leave behind, one you can rise above. He doesn't speak during the flight. He just watches. The pilot up front, hands steady on the controls, the ground falling away beneath them, the horizon expanding in every direction. And somewhere in that 6-year-old brain, a blueprint begins forming. This is what life could be. This is what's possible. He won't talk about this moment often. He won't talk about most moments often. But 63 years later, when he steps onto the lunar surface and becomes the most famous human being who has ever lived, the trajectory starts here, in the back of a trimotor over Cleveland, when he's 6 years old and the ground falls away beneath him for the first time. You think you know this story. American boy dreams of flying, becomes a pilot, gets selected as an astronaut, lands on the moon, says something immortal, returns home a hero. The end. You don't know this story. Because the real story is about what it costs to be the first human being to touch another world. About what happens when the greatest achievement in human history belongs to a man who never wanted to talk about it. About how the most famous person on Earth spent the rest of his life trying to disappear. Before we go there, I need to ask something. If you're finding this valuable, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes this work possible. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. I love seeing where this story reaches. Now, back to the boy in the airplane. Neil Armstrong learns to fly before he learns to drive. Think about that. He earns his pilot's license at 16. He can take a Piper Cub into the sky solo before he can legally take a car to the grocery store. This isn't normal teenage behavior, even in 1946, when aviation is still young enough to feel like magic. The small airport outside Wapakoneta becomes his second home. His real home is a modest house on the edge of town, where his mother Viola teaches music and his father audits accounts for the state of Ohio. They move frequently, Stephen's job demanding relocations across the state. Neil attends 16 different schools before graduating high school. He never quite fits in anywhere long enough to form deep friendships. But the sky doesn't care how many times you've moved. The sky is consistent. He pays for the lessons himself, $9 per hour. He works at the local pharmacy, stocking shelves and sweeping floors for 35 cents an hour. He works at the hardware store, counting nails and cutting rope. He mows lawns. He does whatever generates income. His parents don't have money for this. Nobody has money for this. But the boy who rode in the trimotor at 6 has been moving toward the sky ever since, and nothing is going to stop him. His flight instructor, a barnstormer named Aubrey Knudegard, recognizes something in the teenager, a quietness that isn't shyness, a focus that isn't obsession. The kid asks good questions. He listens to answers. He doesn't need to be told things twice. And when he's at the controls, he doesn't waste movement. Every input is deliberate, calculated. By the time Neil solos for the first time, Knudegard has already decided this kid will either become a tremendous pilot or die trying. Probably the former. The kid has instincts you can't teach. The first solo flight happens on his 16th birthday, August 5th, 1946. The Piper Cub is a simple aircraft, forgiving and stable, but simple doesn't mean easy when you're alone for the first time. No instructor in the other seat. No safety net except your own judgment. Armstrong runs through the checklist. Magnetos, check. Fuel mixture, check. Control surfaces, check. He's done this 50 times with Knudegard beside him, but this time, when he looks to his right, the seat is empty. The takeoff is smooth. The aircraft lifts at exactly the speed he expects. And suddenly he's airborne, alone. 16 years old and flying a plane by himself over the Ohio farmland that's defined his childhood. He doesn't hot dog, doesn't show off. He flies the pattern exactly as taught. Maintains altitude and airspeed. Turns when he's supposed to turn. And when he lines up for landing, the approach is textbook. Threshold speed, flare at the right moment. The wheels touch so gently, the aircraft barely knows it's back on the ground. Knudegard is waiting by the hangar when Neil taxis back. The instructor doesn't say much, just nods. Good flight. That's enough praise for both of them. Neil Armstrong has his pilot's license before his driver's license. This fact will define everything that follows. His teachers remember him as quiet, focused, not the kid who raises his hand for every question, the kid who already knows the answer and sees no reason to prove it. He builds model airplanes with obsessive precision. He reads everything about aviation he can find, and he watches the sky. At Wapakoneta High School, he plays baritone horn in the band. He's good, not exceptional. He participates in student council, attends meetings, votes on resolutions. But ask anyone who went to school with him and they'll struggle to remember specific anecdotes. He was there, he was competent, but he didn't leave a strong impression except for one thing: the kid could fly. By the time he's 17 in 1947, the Navy offers him a scholarship to Purdue University to study aeronautical engineering. This is the deal. They pay for school. He gives them 3 years of service afterward. For a middle-class kid from small-town Ohio, this is winning the lottery. He takes it. Purdue in 1947 is swollen with veterans, men who fought in Europe and the Pacific, who saw things no college kid should see, now studying engineering and agriculture on the GI Bill. Armstrong is one of the youngest students in most of his classes, but he holds his own. The coursework is brutal: differential equations, thermodynamics, structural mechanics, the kind of math and physics that separates those who can from those who can't. He joins the Phi Delta Theta fraternity, mostly because having a social structure seems like the thing you're supposed to do in college. He's not particularly social, doesn't drink much, doesn't chase girls with the enthusiasm of his fraternity brothers, but he shows up for meetings, he fulfills his obligations, and he studies. But there's something you need to understand about the world Neil Armstrong is entering. Because this isn't the peaceful, prosperous America of the 1960s space program. This is 1947. The world just finished tearing itself apart. The atomic bomb just demonstrated that human beings can now destroy civilization in an afternoon. The Soviet Union is building its own nuclear arsenal, and a new kind of war is beginning. They don't call it the Cold War yet, but everyone can feel it coming. Armstrong studies engineering for 2 years at Purdue. Then, in 1949, the Navy calls him up. Active duty, flight training. The scholarship is due. He's 19 years old when he earns his naval aviator wings in 1950. 19? You're probably older than that right now reading this. Imagine being trusted with a multi-million-dollar fighter jet at 19. Imagine the military looking at you and deciding you're ready to fly combat missions. The Naval Flight Training Pipeline is designed to break most people. It starts at Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida. Ground school, navigation, meteorology, aircraft systems. The academic portion alone washes out a third of candidates. If you can't pass the written tests, you don't get near the aircraft. Armstrong excels. He doesn't just memorize procedures. He understands systems. When an instructor describes how an engine works, Armstrong is already 3 steps ahead, thinking about failure modes and redundancies. Then comes the flying. Primary training in the T-6 Texan, basic maneuvers, takeoffs and landings, formation flying. The aircraft is heavier and more powerful than the Piper Cub he learned on. It demands respect, and it reveals who has the instincts and who's just getting by on luck. Armstrong has instincts. His instructors note it in their evaluations. Exceptional stick and rudder skills. Situational awareness beyond his experience level. Recommended for fighter training. Advanced training happens in the F-8F Bearcat, a powerful, single-engine fighter that can climb like a rocket and turn like a dream. This is where they start teaching tactics, how to fight in the air, how to track a target while managing speed and altitude and angle, how to survive when someone is trying to kill you. Because that's exactly where this is going. June 1950. North Korea invades South Korea. The United States commits to defend the South, and within months, American pilots are flying combat missions over the Korean peninsula. By 1951, Neil Armstrong is among them. He's 20 years old. The aircraft carrier USS Essex becomes his home. He flies the Grumman F-9F Panther, a straight-wing jet fighter that can barely break the sound barrier but carries rockets and bombs and flies, strike missions deep into North Korean territory. The missions are called interdiction. Well, that's military language for destroy their supply lines, blow up their bridges, make it impossible for them to fight. The Essex operates in the Sea of Japan, close enough to the Korean coast that launch cycles run constantly. Planes catapult off the bow every few minutes, land on the stern, refuel, rearm, launch again. The carrier deck is controlled chaos. Aircraft handlers in colored jerseys direct traffic. The catapult crews hook planes to the steam-powered launcher. And pilots, most of them barely old enough to vote, climb into cockpits and prepare to fly into hostile airspace. Armstrong's first combat mission is an armed reconnaissance flight over the Wonsan area. 4 Panthers in formation. The mission brief is simple. Find targets of opportunity and destroy them. Supply trucks, railroad yards, anything that supports the North Korean war effort. The coast appears beneath them, grey and mountainous. Armstrong is flying wing position, following his section leader. The procedure is to stay low after crossing the coast, making anti-aircraft fire more difficult. But low also means less time to react if something goes wrong. They find a railroad bridge. The section leader calls it out. Target, 12 o'clock, 2 miles. Follow me in. The Panthers dive. Armstrong arms his rockets. The target grows larger in his sight. He's done this in training hundreds of times, but training doesn't include people shooting back. The anti-aircraft fire starts at 4,000 feet, puffs of black smoke appearing in the air around them. Each puff represents shrapnel that can tear through aircraft skin like paper. The trick is to not think about it. Focus on the target. Maintain the dive angle. Wait for weapons range. His section leader fires. Rockets streak from the wings toward the bridge. Armstrong follows a second later. The rockets motor away, trailing white smoke. Then he's pulling out of the dive, G-forces pressing him into his seat, and the bridge is exploding behind him. They egress over the water, all 4 aircraft accounted for. The post-mission debrief is short. Bridge destroyed, no aircraft damage, textbook execution. Armstrong flies 78 combat missions, 78. Before he's legally old enough to buy a beer in most states, he's flying strike missions in an active war zone. Each mission is different. Some are routine. Others become stories you tell later if you survive to tell them. There's the mission where they suppress enemy anti-aircraft positions, flying so low that Armstrong can see individual soldiers running for cover. There's the mission where his wingman takes a hit and barely makes it back to the carrier, landing with half his tail shot away. And then there's September 3rd, 1951, the mission that nearly ends everything. And on September 3rd, 1951, one of those missions nearly kills him. He's flying low over the North Korean countryside, conducting reconnaissance. The target is a supply depot near Wonsan. Intelligence suggests the area is heavily defended, but the depot is important enough to justify the risk. Armstrong is part of a 4-plane section. They approach at 500 feet, fast and low, to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire. The landscape below is mountainous, covered in scrub brush and scattered trees. There's a beauty to it that seems wrong given what they're about to do. The anti-aircraft fire comes up like a curtain. Tracer rounds light up the air around him. You can't dodge individual bullets. Can't see them coming. The best you can do is not fly straight and level for too long. Make yourself a harder target. He's focused on the target when something hits the aircraft. A cable-suspended barricade strung across a valley designed specifically to catch low-flying aircraft. The Panther's right wing hits the cable. The impact is immediate and violent. The control cable severs. The plane starts to shake. And Neil Armstrong, age 20, realizes he's about to die unless he does something right now. The aircraft is barely controllable. Every input to the stick feels wrong, like the plane is fighting him. The engine is still running, which is good, but the damaged wing is generating uneven lift, trying to roll the aircraft. And he's still taking anti-aircraft fire, first priority. Get out of the kill zone. He nurses the throttle, trading speed for altitude. The Panther climbs, shaking like it's about to come apart. Behind him, the rest of his section is calling on the radio. 2, you hit? Affirmative, Armstrong says. His voice is calm, clinical, the same tone he'd use to report a minor malfunction during a training flight. I've got control issues, heading feet wet. Feet wet, over water, where ejecting means pickup by a Navy helicopter instead of capture by enemy forces. He manages to keep the crippled jet airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. Then he ejects. The canopy blows. The ejection seat fires. And he's falling through Korean airspace with a parachute, hoping he lands somewhere the enemy can't reach him. The ejection sequence happens in seconds but feels like minutes. The rocket motor beneath the seat fires, accelerating him away from the aircraft. The wind blast is violent. Then the drogue chute deploys, stabilizing his fall. Then the main parachute opens with a jolt that feels like being hit by a truck. And then he's floating. Silent except for the wind. The Panther is already gone, disappearing toward the coast. Below him, the Korean countryside is green and mountainous and potentially filled with people who want him dead. He lands near an airfield. American forces recover him. He returns to the Essex and flies the next mission on schedule. The other pilots want to know what happened, what it felt like to eject in combat. Whether he was scared, Armstrong gives the technical details. Cable severed the control surface. Aircraft was unflyable. Ejection was the only option. He doesn't mention his heart rate, doesn't mention the moment of pure terror when he realized the aircraft was hit. Doesn't mention that he couldn't sleep that night, kept seeing the tracer fire in his mind. He will never, in his entire life, describe this as heroic. If you ask him about it later, he'll say he was doing his job. He'll say other pilots had it worse. He'll deflect and minimize and redirect the conversation to someone else. This becomes a pattern. Remember it, because this pattern will define everything that comes after. Armstrong returns from Korea in 1952 with the Air Medal and 2 gold stars. He's 21 years old and he's already survived more than most people experience in a lifetime. He goes back to Purdue, completes his engineering degree in 1955, and immediately goes looking for the most dangerous flying job in America. He finds it at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Edwards is where the experimental aircraft live, the X-planes. The weird, rocket-powered craft that exist on the edge between airplane and spacecraft. These are the machines that break every rule, push every boundary, and occasionally explode on the runway or disintegrate at altitude or auger into the desert floor at 700 miles per hour. The base sits in the Mojave Desert, surrounded by dry lake beds that make perfect emergency landing strips. The heat in summer is brutal, the isolation is complete, and the work is the most dangerous flying in the world. Armstrong joins NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. This is NASA's predecessor, the organization testing the limits of what aircraft can do. And the job is simple. Take experimental aircraft nobody has ever flown before, push them to their design limits, and try not to die. He's a natural. The test pilot community at Edwards has a hierarchy. At the top are the glamour boys, the guys who break records and make headlines. Chuck Yeager, who broke the sound barrier. Scott Crossfield, who pushed past Mach II. These guys are famous for being fearless, for having what Tom Wolfe will later call the right stuff. Other test pilots talk about their exploits. They're famous for it. Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, Scott Crossfield pushing Mach II. These guys are celebrities in the aviation world, larger-than-life personalities who treat test flying like gunfighting. Armstrong treats it like engineering. He's not interested in breaking records for the sake of glory. He's interested in data. Each flight is an experiment. Each maneuver generates information. And the point is to expand the envelope of what's possible while bringing the aircraft and pilot back safely. His flight logs from this period read like a catalogue of experimental aircraft. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-101 Voodoo, the F-104 Starfighter, each one pushing boundaries in different ways, each one with its own quirks and dangers. But the aircraft that defines this period is the X-15. The X-15 is not really an airplane, it's a rocket with wings, launched from beneath a B-52 bomber at 45,000 feet. Rocket engine ignites, and for the next few minutes, you're riding a controlled explosion to the edge of space. He flies over 900 test flights between 1955 and 1962. He flies the X-15, the rocket plane that reaches the edge of space to altitudes above 200,000 feet. That's 39 miles straight up. At that altitude, the sky turns black. The curve of the Earth becomes visible. You can see the stars in the middle of the day. The X-15 flights are unlike anything else. You're not taking off from a runway. You're hanging beneath a B-52 in a pressurized cockpit, waiting for the drop. When the release comes, you fall free for a second. Then you light the rocket motor, and the acceleration is violent. 3, 4, 5 times the force of gravity pressing you back into the seat. The rocket burn lasts maybe 90 seconds, but in those 90 seconds, you go from subsonic to 5 times the speed of sound. The aircraft climbs at a ridiculous angle, 40, 50 degrees nose up. The sky ahead darkens, the air gets thinner, and then the engine cuts out because there's not enough oxygen to sustain combustion. You're still climbing on momentum. The aircraft arcs over the top of its trajectory, and for a few minutes, you're in space, not orbit. Just up high enough that the atmosphere doesn't exist anymore. The view is spectacular. Earth curves away in every direction. The horizon glows blue, and above, the stars don't twinkle. They're steady points of light in perfect blackness because there's no atmosphere to distort them. Then gravity wins. The aircraft starts falling. You re-enter the atmosphere carefully, managing heating and control. The X-15 has reaction control thrusters for maneuvering in vacuum, where traditional control surfaces don't work. You use those until the air gets thick enough for aerodynamics to matter again, and then you glide back to Edwards and land on the lake bed at 200 miles per hour, hoping the landing gear holds. Armstrong flies 7 X-15 missions. His highest flight reaches 207,500 feet. He's already been to space, just not in a spacecraft. In 1956, he marries Janet Sheeran. She's a home economics major from Evanston, Illinois. Smart, grounded, everything he isn't. They meet at a party. She knows he's a test pilot, but doesn't know much about aviation. He likes that. She sees him as Neil, not as the guy who flies experimental aircraft. Their courtship is brief. A few months of dates, dinners and movies, walks around campus. He's not romantic in the traditional sense, doesn't write poetry or make grand gestures, but he's reliable, present. And when he asks her to marry him, she says yes. They settle into married life in the California desert. And in 1957, their first son, Eric, is born. The family looks normal. Test pilot, homemaker wife, baby boy. The American dream in miniature. Janet quickly learns what it means to be married to a test pilot. The phone calls when flights run late. The uncertainty. She never asks him if he's scared, and he never volunteers the information. They develop an unspoken agreement. He does the dangerous work, she maintains the home. It's traditional, it's the 1950s, and it works until it doesn't. But something is happening in the world outside the desert, something that will change everything. October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It's a metal sphere the size of a beach ball that does nothing but orbit the Earth and broadcast a radio beep. But that beep changes history. Armstrong hears about Sputnik on the radio at Edwards. His first reaction is professional interest. They put a satellite in orbit. That's impressive engineering. The rocket equations are brutal. Getting anything into orbit requires precision and power. The Soviets just demonstrated they have both. His second reaction comes when he understands the implications. Because the rocket that put Sputnik in orbit can put a nuclear warhead on New York just as easily. The Soviets didn't just reach space first. They demonstrated they can strike anywhere on Earth within minutes. And there's nothing America can do to stop them. The space race begins that day. Not because anyone cares about science or exploration, because survival demands it. In 1958, NACA becomes NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The organization's mission transforms overnight from experimental aircraft to space capsules. And in 1959, NASA selects the first 7 astronauts, the Mercury 7, who will carry America into orbit. Armstrong watches this happen. He's still flying the X-15, still pushing the edge of what's possible, but he sees where the future is going. He considers applying for the Mercury program, but decides against it. The X-15 work is too interesting. Space is coming, but it's not here yet. He has time. Then, in 1959, his second child is born. A daughter. They name her Karen. She's beautiful, blonde hair, bright eyes. They call her Muffy, a family nickname. Eric, now 2, is fascinated by his baby sister. The Armstrong household settles into a rhythm. Neil flies, Janet manages the home, the children grow. And for 2 years, everything is fine. Until it isn't. In 1961, Karen starts having problems. She's unsteady, she falls down. At first, it seems like clumsiness, the normal stumbling of a toddler learning to walk. But it gets worse. She reaches for toys and misses. Her balance deteriorates. Janet takes her to doctors. The first doctor thinks it's an ear infection affecting balance. They treat it. The symptoms don't improve. The second doctor recommends more tests. Neurological exam, X-rays. The technology in 1961 is primitive. They can't see inside the brain the way modern MRI scanners can, but they can see enough. The diagnosis comes back like a death sentence: diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, a brain tumor growing in the brainstem, inoperable, fatal. The doctor is clinical when he delivers the news. Armstrong appreciates that. He doesn't need it sugar-coated, just the facts. What are the treatment options? What's the prognosis? The answers are brutal. No surgery. The tumor is in a location that makes it untouchable. Radiation might slow the growth, might buy time, but there's no cure. Children with this diagnosis live months, maybe a year. Janet cries. Armstrong doesn't, at least not in the doctor's office. He asks questions. What will the progression look like? What symptoms should they expect? What can they do to make her comfortable? They try radiation treatment. It's 1961. Medical technology is primitive compared to today. The treatments happen at a hospital in Los Angeles. They make the drive from Edwards regularly. Karen is strapped to a table. The radiation machine hums, and her parents wait outside, hoping this will help. The radiation makes her sick. Nausea, fatigue. Her beautiful blonde hair falls out in patches, and the tumor keeps growing. She starts losing motor function, can't walk anymore, can't feed herself. Janet and Neil take turns holding her, trying to comfort her when she cries. There's nothing they can do except be present and watch their daughter die by degrees. Eric is too young to fully understand what's happening. He knows his sister is sick, knows she's not getting better, but the full weight of it, the finality, that's beyond a 4-year-old's comprehension. Armstrong goes to work. He flies the X-15, he files reports. Colleagues who know about Karen ask how she's doing. He gives brief updates. She's declining. The treatment isn't working. And then he changes the subject back to work because work is something he can control. Karen Ann Armstrong dies on January 28, 1962. She's 2 years old, 2 years and 3 months. And her father, the test pilot who survived combat missions and experimental aircraft crashes, the man who never shows fear in the cockpit, goes to work the next day. The funeral is small, family and close friends. Janet is devastated, visibly broken. Armstrong is composed. He holds her hand. He greets mourners. He thanks people for coming. And inside, something is dying that will never recover. He doesn't talk about it. Not with colleagues, not with friends, barely with family. Janet later says he would sometimes sit at the piano and play the same melancholy piece over and over, the only time she saw his grief surface. But otherwise he compartmentalizes, he seals it off, he functions. The piece is On a Blue Spring Day by Franz Lehár, slow and melancholic. He plays it late at night when Janet is already asleep. His fingers find the keys in the dark, and the music becomes the only language he has for grief that has no other outlet. And 6 months later, in September 1962, NASA announces the selection of a second group of astronauts, 9 men chosen from hundreds of applicants. They call them the New 9. Neil Armstrong is among them. You can draw a straight line between Karen's death and his astronaut application. The timeline doesn't lie. His daughter dies in January. He applies to be an astronaut in the spring. He's selected in September. Did grief drive him to space? Did he need something dangerous enough, significant enough, To fill the hole her death left behind? He never says. He never explains. And that silence becomes the foundation of everything that follows. Because this is the central mystery of Neil Armstrong's life. The man who achieved the greatest accomplishment in human history never wanted to talk about what drove him to do it. The astronaut training begins in 1962. 9 new men join the 7 Mercury veterans. Armstrong is different from most of them. He's a civilian, the only one in his group. The others are military test pilots who graduated from the Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards. Armstrong took a different path. He flew the X-15s, yes, but he was a NACA engineer who flew, not a military pilot who studied engineering. Some people question whether a civilian belongs in the astronaut corps. Some people think the military test pilot culture is essential. Armstrong doesn't argue, he just does the work. The training is brutal. Geology courses because they might be walking on the moon someday. They take field trips to volcanic formations in Arizona and Hawaii. The instructors teach them to identify rock types, to understand crater formation, to think like field scientists. Most of the astronauts find this tedious. Armstrong is fascinated, navigation and orbital mechanics. This is pure mathematics, calculating rendezvous trajectories, understanding how changing velocity in one direction affects your orbit in ways that aren't intuitive. The equations are complex. Armstrong loves them. Emergency procedures, simulations of every possible failure mode. They strap you into a centrifuge and spin you until the G-forces compress your chest and drain blood from your brain, and you're trying not to black out while solving math problems. The centrifuge at the Naval Air Development Center can pull 20 Gs. They don't take you that high, but they take you to 8, 9 Gs. Your face sags, your vision tunnels, every breath is work. And while this is happening, they're asking you questions, reading instruments, reporting malfunctions, demonstrating that you can still think when your body is screaming. Armstrong's tolerance for Gs is exceptional. His heartbeat stays steady. His responses stay crisp. The technicians monitoring him note it in their reports. This one doesn't rattle. They put you in the Vomit Comet, the KC-135 aircraft that flies parabolic arcs to create brief periods of weightlessness, 20 seconds of floating, then back to normal gravity. Again, 40 parabolas in a flight. You try to practice tasks while your inner ear is screaming that the universe has lost its mind. Most astronauts get sick. It's expected. Your vestibular system hasn't evolved for this. Armstrong doesn't get sick. He adapts quickly. By the 3rd parabola, he's moving confidently in 0G, practicing equipment operations, learning to work without up or down. They drop you in the desert and say, survive. They drop you in the jungle and say, survive. Because if the spacecraft lands off target, if the recovery helicopters can't reach you, if something goes wrong, you need to be able to keep yourself alive until help arrives. The survival training happens in Panama, dense jungle, high humidity, insects everywhere. They give you minimal supplies and instructions. The recovery team will find you in 3 days. Until then, stay alive. Armstrong builds a shelter, finds water, doesn't waste energy. Other astronauts try to hunt for food, set elaborate traps. Armstrong conserves his resources and waits. When the recovery team arrives, he's in good shape. Not comfortable, but functional. Armstrong absorbs it all. He studies, he practices, he doesn't grandstand. And in 1965, NASA assigns him to his first mission, Gemini 8. The spacecraft is a 2-man capsule, slightly larger than Mercury, designed to test the procedures needed for a moon landing, orbital rendezvous, docking, spacewalks, everything Apollo will require, tested first in Earth orbit. Armstrong will command. David Scott, a rookie astronaut, will be pilot. Their mission: launch into orbit, rendezvous with an unmanned target vehicle called a Gemini, and perform the first docking of 2 spacecraft in history. The Soviets are already attempting this. The space race isn't over. America is still catching up. Gemini 8 needs to succeed. The training for Gemini 8 is intensive. Armstrong and Scott spend hundreds of hours in simulators. The Gemini simulator is a precise replica of the spacecraft interior. Every switch, every instrument, exactly where it will be in flight. They practice normal procedures until they can run through them in their sleep. Then they practice malfunctions. The simulator instructors are creative with failures. They kill systems at the worst possible moments. Electrical failures during rendezvous, thruster malfunctions during docking, combinations of failures that shouldn't happen but might. The goal is to make the astronauts unflappable, to train them so thoroughly that crisis becomes just another problem to solve. Armstrong and Scott develop a working rhythm. Scott handles communication and systems monitoring. Armstrong focuses on flying. They don't need to talk much. Each knows his role. March 16, 1966. The mission begins. The launch is perfect. The Titan II rocket lifts off from Launch Complex 19 at Cape Kennedy. The acceleration presses them back into their seats. 2.5 minutes later, the first stage separates. The second stage fires. And Gemini 8 is in orbit. The Gemini is already in orbit, waiting, launched an hour earlier. It's a cylindrical spacecraft, unmanned, equipped with a docking collar. The plan is to rendezvous, dock, and then use the Gemini's engine to boost to a higher orbit. Armstrong pilots the Gemini capsule through a series of rendezvous maneuvers, closing the distance carefully, matching orbits. This is orbital mechanics in practice. You can't just point at your target and accelerate. Every burn changes your orbit in complex ways. You have to think in 3 dimensions and plan moves ahead. 6.5 hours after launch, the 2 spacecraft meet in orbit over the Pacific Ocean. Armstrong flies closer, 100 feet, 50 feet, 20 feet. The docking mechanism is a probe and drogue system. Gemini has the probe, a Gemini has the drogue. Line them up, make contact, lock. The closure is delicate, too much speed, and the collision damages both spacecraft. Too little and the docking latches won't engage. Armstrong uses tiny thruster pulses. Inch forward, adjust alignment. Inch forward again. Scott calls out range and closure rate. 10 feet, closure rate 0.2, looking good. Armstrong makes one final correction. The probe enters the drogue. The latches engage with a solid thunk that transmits through the spacecraft structure. Contact. The latches engage. Gemini 8 and a Gemini are docked, first time in history. The radio crackles with congratulations from mission control. The crew allows themselves a moment of satisfaction. "We're docked," Scott radios to Houston. "It's really a smoothie." 27 minutes later, the spacecraft begins to roll. At first, it's barely noticeable. A slight drift. Scott thinks maybe the Gemini's attitude control system is misfiring. Armstrong tries to correct with Gemini's thrusters. The roll gets worse. "Neil, we're in a bank," Scott says. Armstrong is already working the problem. He tries to counter the roll with Gemini's thrusters. The rate increases. They undock from the Gemini. The problem should stop. It doesn't. The spacecraft is spinning faster now. 1 revolution per second, then faster. The instrument panels are blurring. The stars outside the window are streaking. And the angular velocity is approaching the limit where human beings lose consciousness. The spin rate is increasing. 2 revolutions per second now the G-forces are building. Armstrong's vision is starting to tunnel. Scott is bracing against the instrument panel. "You need to understand what's happening here. They're in orbit, 200 miles above Earth, spinning faster and faster. If they black out, they can't control the spacecraft. If they can't control the spacecraft, they die in orbit, and the capsule becomes a tomb. Armstrong's training takes over. He runs through the possible causes. The Agena is undocked, so it's not that. Must be Gemini. Must be the thrusters. The orbital maneuvering system is still active. He starts shutting systems down, isolating the problem. One of Gemini's attitude control thrusters has stuck open. It's firing continuously, imparting angular momentum, spinning them faster and faster. The only way to stop it is to shut down the entire orbital maneuvering system and switch to the re-entry control system, a completely separate set of thrusters. But here's the problem. Mission rules state that if you activate the re-entry control system, you have to abort the mission and return to Earth immediately. Those thrusters use fuel you need for re-entry. You can't waste them and still come home safely. The spacecraft is spinning at 360 degrees per second. Armstrong is about to lose consciousness. He makes the decision. He activates the re-entry control system. He takes manual control. He fires thrusters against the spin. Slowly, the rotation decreases. Slowly, the stars stop streaking. The spacecraft stabilizes. Scott is conscious, but barely. "Okay, we're all right now," he manages to say. Armstrong's heart rate, monitored by biomedical telemetry, shows that it never exceeded 90 beats per minute during the entire crisis. He was approaching blackout while spinning out of control in orbit. And his pulse barely changed. They're safe, but the mission is over. They've been in space for 10 hours and 41 minutes. And they're coming home. Gemini 8 splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. The recovery forces retrieve them, and when the investigation concludes, the report states that Armstrong's decision saved both astronauts' lives. The thruster failure was a random electrical short, nothing they could have predicted, but Armstrong's response under extreme stress, his ability to diagnose and solve the problem while spinning toward unconsciousness, demonstrated exactly the kind of crisis management NASA needed for the Apollo program. They're going to remember this. When it's time to choose who commands the first moon landing, they're going to remember the test pilot who saved Gemini 8. But Armstrong doesn't see it as heroic. He sees it as a problem that required a solution, and he's already thinking about the next mission. In 1963, his third child, Mark, was born. By 1966, the family is living in El Lago, Texas, near the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. 2 boys, no daughter. Karen's name doesn't come up in conversation. Armstrong plays with his sons. He goes to work. He trains for the next mission. Janet tries to make the house feel normal. Birthday parties for the boys. Neighborhood barbecues. The astronaut community in El Lago is tight-knit. Everyone understands the pressures, but everyone also maintains the facade that this is just another job, just another suburban neighborhood. Armstrong mows the lawn on Saturdays. He helps Eric and Mark build model rockets in the garage. To an outside observer, he's just another dad in Texas. But inside, he's processing trajectory calculations and mission profiles, and the constant awareness that the next flight might be the one that doesn't come back. NASA assigns him to Apollo 11's backup crew in 1967, but then the fire happens. January 27th, 1967, Apollo 1 Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee are running a routine test inside the command module, simulating launch procedures. Pure oxygen atmosphere. Electrical systems active, a spark somewhere in the wiring. The fire spreads in seconds. The cabin pressure makes the hatch impossible to open from inside. All 3 astronauts die in less than a minute. Armstrong is at the Cape when it happens, not in the operations room but nearby. He hears about the fire minutes after it starts. Hears that they can't get the hatch open. Hears that Grissom and the crew are gone. Gus Grissom was a Mercury veteran, a peer, someone Armstrong respected. And now he's dead, killed not by the dangers of space but by a preventable accident during a ground test. The entire Apollo program stops. NASA investigates. They redesign the spacecraft. They implement new safety protocols. And the launch schedule gets pushed back 18 months. The investigation reveals systematic failures, flammable materials in the cabin, poor wiring design, the hatch that opened inward, impossible to open when cabin pressure exceeded external pressure. It's a catalogue of engineering mistakes that should have been caught. Armstrong serves on the review board. He reads the reports. He examines the burned-out command module. And he understands that this could have been any of them. It could have been him in that capsule. It was random chance that put Grissom's crew in the test schedule instead of someone else. The redesign takes months. New materials. New procedures. The hatch now opens outward in seconds. The fire is a tragedy, but it forces NASA to confront flaws that would have killed astronauts eventually. Better to find them now. This is when Armstrong starts training for the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, the LLRV. It's an ungainly contraption that looks like a flying bed frame built to simulate landing on the moon. It uses a jet engine pointed downward to cancel 5/6 of Earth's gravity, creating the equivalent of lunar gravity. Then it uses thrusters, just like the lunar module will, to control descent and landing. The LLRV is dangerous. The pilots call it the flying bedstead. Some call it the Widowmaker. It's killed test pilots. It's almost impossible to fly, and it's essential training because landing on the moon will require skills no pilot has ever needed before. Armstrong practices. Again and again, takeoff, hover, landing. The LLRV responds like nothing else that flies. It's twitchy, unstable, barely controlled. You're balancing on a column of thrust with no margin for error. May 6th, 1968. Armstrong is practicing simulated moon landings. He's 200 feet in the air when the LLRV starts going wrong. The vehicle pitches forward. He applies correction. It doesn't respond. The LLRV is tumbling now, falling toward the lake bed. Armstrong ejects. The rocket-powered ejection seat fires. He clears the vehicle by a fraction of a second. The parachute deploys. The LLRV impacts and explodes. Armstrong lands. He walks back to his office. He starts writing his report. His colleagues find him at his desk an hour later, doing paperwork. The LLRV is still burning on the lake bed. Armstrong survived a crash that should have killed him. And he's filing flight reports. He does not mention that his hands were shaking. He does not mention that he went home that night and sat at the piano and didn't speak. You learn these details later, years later, from people who knew him, from Janet, because Armstrong doesn't talk about fear. Armstrong doesn't talk about what it costs to be the man who never shows fear. In January 1969, NASA makes it official. Neil Armstrong will command Apollo 11, the first attempt at a moon landing. Buzz Aldrin will be lunar module pilot. Michael Collins will be command module pilot, staying in lunar orbit while Armstrong and Aldrin descend to the surface. The crew assignment follows rotation. Armstrong was backup commander for Apollo 8, so he gets the command of Apollo 11. This is how NASA assigns missions. Not politics, not favoritism, rotation. But some people wonder if there's more to it. Armstrong is civilian. The first moon landing will be a moment for all humanity, not America. Having a civilian commander sends a different message than having a military pilot. And Armstrong's personality, his humility, his refusal to grandstand, makes him the perfect face for an achievement that needs to transcend nationalism. Whether NASA consciously considered this, nobody says. But the assignment stands. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins train for 6 months. They practice in simulators that replicate every phase of the mission. They study lunar maps. They plan landing sites. They prepare for every possible emergency and some impossible ones. The simulator sessions run 8, 10, 12 hours. They sit in mock-ups of the spacecraft, running through procedures until they're automatic. Launch sequences, orbital maneuvers, lunar descent, everything scripted, everything practiced. The Lunar Module Simulator is particularly intense. It's a full-scale replica of the LM cockpit, mounted on motion platforms that simulate lunar gravity. Armstrong stands at the controls, Aldrin beside him, and they practice landing approaches over and over. The instructors throw malfunctions at them: computer alarms, engine failures, guidance system errors. Every session is designed to train them to handle crisis without panic. Armstrong's approach is methodical. When an alarm sounds, he doesn't react emotionally. He identifies the problem, prioritizes, and takes the appropriate action. The instructors note that he's almost impossible to fluster. You can stack failures on top of failures, and he just works through them systematically. The mission profile is insane when you think about it clearly. They'll launch on top of a Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built, riding 36 stories of controlled explosions into orbit. They'll spend 3 days traveling to the moon. They'll separate the lunar module and descend to the surface while the command module circles overhead. They'll land on terrain nobody has ever touched. They'll walk outside in vacuum. Then they'll launch from the moon, rendezvous with the command module in lunar orbit, and spend 3 more days coming home. Every phase requires precision. Every phase has failure modes that result in death. The margins are thin, the systems are complex. And nobody has ever done this before. July 16, 1969, launch day. The Saturn V stands at Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center. Over 1 million people gather along beaches and roads to watch. President Nixon is in Washington. The Soviet Union is watching. The entire world is watching. Armstrong wakes at 4:15 a.m., breakfast with the crew, steak and eggs, traditional astronaut pre-flight meal. The medical team conducts final checks, blood pressure, heart rate, everything normal. They suit up. The pressure suits are custom-fitted, bulky white garments with helmets and gloves. The process takes nearly an hour. Technicians help them into the suits, check seals, verify communications. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins ride the elevator to the top of the gantry tower. They enter the command module, a cone-shaped capsule named Columbia. The hatch seals. They wait. The countdown proceeds. Tanks fill with liquid oxygen and hydrogen. Systems activate. And at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, the 5 F1 engines at the base of the Saturn V ignite. 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The launch platform shakes. The rocket rises, slowly at first, then faster. In 2.5 minutes, the first stage burns out and separates. The second stage fires. The rocket is already 70 miles high and moving 4,000 miles per hour. Armstrong monitors instruments. The ride is smoother than he expected. The G-forces build but never become uncomfortable. And when the second stage cuts off and the third stage fires, they're well on their way to orbit. 11 minutes after launch, the third stage cuts off. Apollo 11 is in Earth orbit. The crew checks systems. Everything is functional. Mission Control gives the order. You are go for trans-lunar injection. The third stage fires again. Apollo 11 accelerates to 25,000 miles per hour, escaping Earth's gravity. They're going to the moon. The journey takes 3 days. 3 days in a spacecraft the size of a small car. They eat freeze-dried food. They sleep in shifts. They watch Earth shrink behind them and the moon grow larger ahead. And they wait. The command module interior is cramped. 3 seats arranged side by side, instrument panels covering every surface, the smell of machinery and human bodies in close quarters. There's no shower, no privacy. They're living together in a space smaller than most bathrooms. Armstrong uses the time to review procedures, lunar landing checklist, abort modes, contingency plans. He's already memorized everything, but reviewing helps him stay focused. Collins handles navigation, taking star sights with the onboard telescope, calculating their position, making minor course corrections with the reaction control thrusters. Aldrin manages systems, monitoring fuel cells, checking oxygen levels, ensuring that all the critical systems are functioning within parameters. They talk occasionally. Not about anything profound, just technical matters, status updates, observations. The camaraderie is professional, not personal. They respect each other, but they're not friends in the traditional sense. On July 19th, Apollo 11 enters lunar orbit. The moon is grey and cratered and airless beneath them. They circle 60 miles above the surface, preparing for the next phase. The moon up close is different from the moon seen from Earth. The craters are sharper, the shadows are absolute, black as ink. There's a harshness to it that photographs don't capture. Armstrong looks out the window at the landing site. The Sea of Tranquility, a relatively smooth area chosen specifically because it looks safe. But safe is relative when you're attempting something nobody has ever done before. July 20th. Armstrong and Aldrin enter the lunar module, a spidery craft named Eagle. Collins stays in Columbia. The two spacecraft separate. Eagle begins its descent. The descent is controlled by the onboard computer, a primitive machine by modern standards with less processing power than a modern calculator, but it's been programmed with the trajectory. It knows when to fire the engine, how long to burn, what angle to maintain. The landing radar activates. The onboard computer, a primitive machine by modern standards but revolutionary for 1969, calculates trajectory and burn times. The descent engine fires, slowing their orbital velocity, allowing lunar gravity to pull them down. Armstrong and Aldrin stand at the controls. There are no seats in the lunar module. You fly it, standing up, held in place by cables and restraints. The engine fires. The descent begins. 12 minutes into the descent, an alarm sounds. Program alarm 1202. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knows what this means. They radio Houston. "Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm," Armstrong says. His voice is calm, like he's asking about the weather. In mission control, controllers scramble to identify the problem. The computer is overloaded. The rendezvous radar, which should be off during descent, is feeding data to the computer, overloading its capacity. But the computer is handling it. It's dumping low-priority tasks to keep essential functions running. A young flight controller named Steve Bales makes the call. Mission control checks. The computer is overloaded. It's receiving too much data from the rendezvous radar, which is still active when it shouldn't be. But the computer is handling it, dumping low-priority tasks to keep essential functions running. "We'll go on that alarm," Houston says. The descent continues. Armstrong trusts the call. The alarm keeps sounding. 1202, then 1201, the computer is managing. He focuses on the descent. At 2,000 feet, Armstrong looks out the window at the designated landing site. It's a crater field. Boulders the size of cars scattered across rough terrain. If they land there, the lunar module could tip over, or damage the landing gear, or trap them on the moon. Armstrong takes manual control. He flies past the crater field, looking for smooth ground. The computer is counting down fuel. 60 seconds, 45 seconds, 30 seconds. He's flying the lunar module manually now, skimming over the lunar surface at low altitude, looking for a safe spot. This is what the LLRV training was for. Hundreds of practice landings prepared him for this moment. Aldrin is calling out altitude and descent rate. 75 feet, down 2.5, 60 feet, down 2.5. Lights on. The lunar surface is kicking up dust now. The descent engine is blasting regolith into clouds. Armstrong can barely see the ground. He's flying on instruments and glimpses through the dust. 30 seconds, Houston says. That's fuel remaining. 30 seconds until the abort criteria. Armstrong is committed. He's found a clear area. He's descending, and he's going to land this spacecraft or die trying. Contact light, Aldrin says. A probe extending from the landing gear has touched the surface. Armstrong shuts down the engine. Eagle drops the final few feet. The landing gear compresses, and the spacecraft settles onto the moon. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. 400,000 miles away, mission control erupts in cheers. The flight director lights a cigar. Controllers hug each other. They've done it. A human spacecraft has landed on another world. Inside the lunar module, Armstrong and Aldrin begin the post-landing checklist. They're supposed to sleep before the moonwalk, but nobody seriously expects them to sleep. The flight plan gets revised. They'll go outside early. The lunar module interior is cramped and cold. The walls are thin aluminum. Outside is vacuum and temperature extremes. Inside is barely habitable. They prepare the spacesuits, the portable life support systems, the helmets, every piece of equipment critical. One seal failure means death. 6.5 hours after landing, Armstrong opens the hatch. He backs out onto the porch, the small platform at the top of the ladder. The television camera mounted on Eagle's descent stage activates. 600 million people on Earth watch a grainy black and white image of a figure in a white spacesuit descending a ladder. Armstrong reaches the bottom. His left foot hovers over the surface. He's about to do something no human being has ever done. He's about to step onto another world. I'm going to step off the LM now. His boot touches lunar soil. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Except he claims he said, a man. The indefinite article that makes the sentence grammatically correct, but the audio is ambiguous. Debate will continue for decades about what he actually said. It doesn't matter, the moment transcends grammar. Neil Armstrong is standing on the moon. The Earth hangs in the black sky, a blue and white marble. The landscape is grey and barren and untouched. The only sounds are his breathing and the radio crackle. He describes the surface. The surface is fine and powdery. I can pick it up loosely with my toe. It does adhere in fine layers like powdered charcoal to the sole and sides of my boots. He's a test pilot. He's reporting observations, but the words carry weight because of where he's standing. 19 minutes later, Aldrin joins him. Beautiful view, Aldrin says. Isn't that something? Armstrong replies. Magnificent sight out here. They spend 2 hours and 31 minutes on the surface. They plant an American flag, but it's not a territorial claim. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies. The flag is symbolic, not legal. They collect 47 pounds of lunar samples. They deploy scientific instruments. They take photographs. They move carefully in the 1/6 gravity, learning how to walk and work in an environment no human has experienced before. And then they go back inside. The moonwalk is over. They sleep badly. The lunar module is cramped and cold, and the adrenaline hasn't worn off, but they sleep some. July 21st. The ascent stage engine fires. Eagle rises from the moon. The descent stage, the ladder, Armstrong climbed down, remains behind. It's still there today. So are the footprints. The moon has no atmosphere, no weather, nothing to erase them. They'll last millions of years. Eagle rendezvous with Columbia, the two spacecraft dock. Armstrong and Aldrin transfer back to the command module with their sample boxes. They seal the hatch. Eagle is jettisoned. It's abandoned in lunar orbit, eventually crashing into the surface somewhere. 3 days later, Apollo 11 returns to Earth. The command module's heat shield glows white-hot during re-entry, shedding speed through friction. The parachutes deploy. The capsule splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. The crew is immediately quarantined. NASA doesn't know if the moon harbors any pathogens. Probably not, but probably isn't good enough. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins spend 3 weeks in isolation, while doctors monitor them for any sign of lunar plague. No plague manifests. On August 13th, they're released. The ticker tape parade in New York draws 4 million people. It's the largest parade in the city's history. Larger than the parade for Eisenhower after World War II, larger than anything. The motorcade crawls through Manhattan's Canyon of Heroes. Paper streams from office windows like rain. The roar of the crowd is physical, a wall of sound that makes conversation impossible. Armstrong sits in the convertible beside Aldrin and Collins, all three in business suits, waving mechanically to an ocean of faces. He's never been comfortable with attention. As a child in Wapakoneta, he avoided the spotlight. As a test pilot, he deflected praise to the engineering teams. And now, riding through New York while millions scream his name, he's performing the role society demands while everything inside him wants to disappear. The signs people hold say things like, "Welcome home, moon men," and "One small step for all mankind." Children sit on their fathers' shoulders, waving American flags. Office workers lean out of windows, throwing confetti and ticker tape. The entire city has stopped to celebrate 3 men who went to another world and came back. But Armstrong notices something else in the crowd. The parents who lost sons in Vietnam, still fighting, still dying, while America celebrates the moon landing. The poor neighborhoods they passed on the way into Manhattan, where the Great Society's promises haven't materialized. The protesters with signs asking why we can spend billions on space while people starve. The parade lasts hours, then there are speeches, then receptions, then dinners. And through it all, Armstrong smiles and waves and says the things people want to hear. The mission was a team effort. We're proud to represent America. This is just the beginning of space exploration. He means these things, but he also feels like he's watching someone else say them, like the real Neil Armstrong is somewhere else and this public figure is just a performance. Armstrong rides in an open car, waving. The crowds scream. Confetti falls like snow. And the man who just walked on the moon looks uncomfortable. This is the part where the story is supposed to end happily. Hero achieves impossible goal, returns home, lives in glory. The end. But that's not what happens. The world tour begins. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins travel to 24 countries in 38 days. They meet presidents and kings. They attend state dinners. They give speeches. Everywhere they go, crowds gather. The moon landing is the greatest achievement of the 20th century, and these are the men who did it. The itinerary is brutal. Paris, London, Rome, The Hague, Brussels, Oslo, Cologne, Tehran, Karachi, Dhaka, Bangkok, Saigon, Darwin, Sydney, Tokyo, Seoul, Guam, Anchorage, Vancouver, Washington, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro. Each city demands speeches, meet and greets, press conferences. In Paris, they present lunar samples, to President Pompidou. In London, they meet the Queen. In Rome, they have an audience with the Pope. And everywhere, the questions are the same. What did the moon feel like? Were you scared? What does this mean for humanity? Armstrong develops a repertoire of responses, technical enough to satisfy curiosity, brief enough to avoid prolonged conversation, humble enough to deflect personal glory to the team. He's performing, and he knows it. But the alternative is to engage honestly with how the experience affected him, and he's not prepared to do that publicly. The toll shows in small ways. He's losing weight, not eating enough between events. He sleeps poorly in hotel rooms that all blur together. Janet, back home with the boys, tries to reach him by phone but gets schedules instead of conversations. "I'm fine," he tells her. "Just busy." Aldrin handles the tour differently. He's more comfortable with attention, more willing to engage emotionally with the significance of what they've done, but even he finds the pace exhausting. Collins, who didn't walk on the moon, becomes the diplomat of the group. He smooths tensions, manages logistics, keeps the machine running, and, through it all, the world watches, because the Apollo 11 astronauts aren't just representing themselves or NASA or America. They're representing the idea that human beings can do impossible things, that we can overcome our limitations, that the future is brighter than the present. It's a heavy symbolism to carry, especially for a man who just wanted to fly. Armstrong hates it. He does the tour because NASA requires it. He gives the speeches because it's part of the job. But the discomfort is visible to anyone paying attention. He doesn't want to be famous. He doesn't want to be a symbol. He wants to be an engineer who got to do something extraordinary and then go back to being an engineer. The world won't let him. In 1970, NASA appoints him Deputy Associate Administrator for Aeronautics. It's a desk job, Washington politics, committee meetings, the opposite of flying. He lasts 1 year before resigning. In 1971, he becomes a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati. This is what he wants: teaching, research, technical work without celebrity. The university campus sits on a hill overlooking the city. Armstrong buys a farmhouse in nearby Lebanon, 40 minutes north. He wants space, literal and figurative distance from the world that won't stop celebrating him. His first class has 200 students. Most of them are there because Neil Armstrong is teaching. He knows this. On the first day, he addresses it directly. "I'm here to teach aerospace engineering," he tells them. "If you're here because you think this class will be about the moon landing, you're in the wrong room. We're going to study thermodynamics, structural analysis, and propulsion systems. The work will be difficult. Many of you will drop this course. If you're serious about engineering, stay. If you want stories, there are books." Half the class drops within 2 weeks. The ones who remain discover that Armstrong is a demanding but fair professor. He doesn't grade on curves. He expects precision, but he's also willing to spend hours with students who struggle, explaining concepts until they understand. He develops a reputation on campus, the famous recluse, the man who walked on the moon and now teaches calculus to undergraduates. Students debate whether to approach him. Some do, asking for autographs or photos. He usually declines politely. "I'm just your professor," he says. But it follows him anyway. Students want to talk about the moon. Reporters call constantly. People recognize him in grocery stores. The fame is inescapable. The farmhouse becomes his refuge. 200 acres of rolling hills and woods. He raises cattle, fixes fences, maintains equipment. The physical work is meditative. When he's repairing a tractor or mending a fence line, he's just a farmer. The moon is 238 Wurzul miles away. The fame can't reach him here, except it does. Helicopters sometimes fly over, news crews hoping to get footage of Neil Armstrong on his tractor. Reporters show up at the gate, asking for interviews. Strangers send letters to the university, forwarded to his office. Everyone wants something from him. A piece of history. Validation. Connection to the impossible achievement. He answers some letters, declines most interview requests, continues teaching, and slowly, incrementally, tries to build a life that isn't defined by 21 hours on the lunar surface. His marriage is falling apart. The signs are there for anyone paying attention: separate bedrooms, conversations that never go deeper than logistics. Janet planning family events around Neil's schedule, which he then cancels or attends half-heartedly. The boys, Eric and Mark, teenagers now, notice but don't say anything. What do you say when your father is the most famous man on earth but barely speaks at the dinner table? Janet later describes these years as increasingly distant. Neil withdraws emotionally. He's physically present but psychologically absent. He doesn't talk about his feelings. He doesn't discuss Karen, even though it's been a decade since she died. He doesn't explain what the moon landing means to him or how the fame affects him. She tries. In the early 70s, she suggests counseling. He declines. "Nothing's wrong," he says. "I'm just busy." She asks if the moon changed him. If the experience broke something, he doesn't answer directly, just says it was a job that needed doing, and he did it. End of discussion. She watches him play the piano late at night. On a blue spring day. The same piece he played after Karen died. Over and over, the only emotional release he allows himself. And she realizes that she's married to a man who processes everything internally and shows nothing externally. The test pilot mentality that made him perfect for Apollo makes him impossible to live with. The irony is that she signed up for this. She married a test pilot knowing the risks, knowing he approached life through engineering principles. But she didn't anticipate the fame, didn't expect that the entire world would want a piece of her husband, and he'd respond by withdrawing completely. The boys suffer too. They love their father. He's present at important events, birthdays and graduations. But he's not emotionally available. They learn not to ask about the moon, learn not to expect deep conversations. They adapt to having a father who's famous but absent. And the marriage continues, not because it's working, but because neither Neil nor Janet knows how to end it. They've invested too much. The boys need stability. And there's an unspoken belief that you don't divorce the first man on the moon. That would be admitting failure, so they maintain the facade. They stay together out of inertia and for the children, but the connection is dying. Years later, after the divorce, Janet will say she should have left sooner. That staying was unfair to both of them. But in the moment, leaving feels impossible. How do you walk away from the most famous man alive? How do you explain that to the world? So she stays, and the distance grows. And the marriage becomes a performance as elaborate as Neil's public appearances. Smile for the cameras. Attend events together. Maintain the illusion of the happy astronaut family. But behind closed doors, they're strangers sharing a house. The man who walked on the moon and the woman who loved him before he was famous, both trapped in roles they never auditioned for, both unable to find a way out. In 1979, Armstrong is working on his farm in Ohio. He's trying to fix something. The details vary depending on who tells the story, and the equipment malfunctions. His wedding ring catches. The machinery pulls. And when it's over, most of his ring finger is gone. He drives himself to the hospital. Doctors save what they can, but the damage is permanent. He loses part of the finger. He doesn't make a big deal about it. It's an accident. These things happen on farms. His reaction is the same as when the LLRV exploded beneath him, or when Gemini 8 started spinning out of control. Assess the problem, implement the solution, move on, but the symbolism is hard to ignore. The man who reached the moon loses his wedding finger in a farm accident. It feels like a metaphor for something, even if he never acknowledges it. The marriage limps forward another 15 years. In 1994, after 38 years together, Neil and Janet divorce. He's 63 years old. The moon landing was 25 years ago, and his marriage, which survived combat missions and test flights and the death of a child, and the most famous moment in human history, finally ends. That same year, he marries Carol Held Knight. She's a widow, intelligent, and private like him. They meet at a golf tournament. The relationship works because she doesn't need him to be Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. She just needs him to be Neil. Their first conversation isn't about the moon, it's about golf scores and the weather. She knows who he is, obviously. Everyone knows who he is. But she doesn't ask for his autograph or ask what the moon felt like. She treats him like a normal person, which at this point in his life is the rarest gift anyone can give him. They date quietly. No press announcements, no public appearances, just dinners and golf and conversations that don't revolve around Apollo. Carol lost her husband years earlier. She understands grief that doesn't have a socially acceptable expression. She doesn't push Neil to open up about Karen or the moon or the weight of being a symbol. She just provides companionship without expectation. When they marry, it's a small ceremony, family only. No media. Exactly what Armstrong wants. The relationship works in ways the first marriage didn't. Carol respects his need for privacy. She doesn't resent his reluctance to leverage his fame. When reporters call asking for interviews, she politely declines on his behalf. When strangers approach in restaurants, she runs interference. She becomes his partner in maintaining the boundaries he needs to survive. They settle into a quiet life together, the farm in Ohio, occasional trips, time with family. Armstrong serves on corporate boards, but selectively. He chooses companies involved in aerospace and technology, places where his expertise matters more than his celebrity. The years pass. Armstrong serves on corporate boards. He makes paid appearances, carefully selected and rare. He gives occasional interviews, always on his terms, usually deflecting questions about himself to talk about the Apollo program or future space exploration. He testifies before Congress occasionally, usually about the space program's direction. He's frustrated by America's retreat from ambitious space exploration. The shuttle program, which he supported initially, has become a low Earth orbit ferry instead of a stepping stone to Mars. The grand vision of Apollo, a sustained human presence in space, has given way to budget cuts and political timidity. In one hearing, a congressman asks him if going to the moon was worth the cost. $15 billion in 1960s money, enough to feed millions, enough to rebuild cities. Armstrong's answer is measured. The moon landing demonstrated what humans can accomplish when we commit to difficult goals. The technological advances developed for Apollo revolutionized industries, weather satellites, communications, materials, science, medical imaging. The return on investment is difficult to calculate, but undeniably positive. But privately, he wonders, Karen died from a brain tumor that 1960s medicine couldn't treat. Would those $15 billion have advanced medical research enough to save her? Would a different set of priorities have given her a chance? He never says this publicly, never questions whether the moon landing was worth it, but the question exists in the spaces between his public statements, in the silence when someone asks if he'd do it again. In 2005, James Hansen publishes First Man, the authorized biography. Hansen spent hundreds of hours interviewing Armstrong, his family, his colleagues. The book reveals details Armstrong never discussed publicly: Karen's death and how it affected him, the strain of fame on his marriage, the complexity behind the stoic public image. Armstrong cooperates with the book because he trusts Hansen to get it right, but he doesn't promote it. He doesn't do the talk show circuit. The book exists for people who want to understand. Everyone else can continue thinking what they already think. In 2011, NASA retires the Space Shuttle program. Armstrong speaks out against this decision. He testifies before Congress. He argues that abandoning human spaceflight capability is a mistake, that America is surrendering the leadership in space exploration it won with Apollo. It's one of the few times he uses his fame as leverage. And it doesn't work. The shuttle program ends anyway. Budget cuts and policy shifts trump the arguments of the first man on the moon. He's 81 years old, and his heart is failing. Coronary artery disease. The vessels supplying blood to his heart muscle are narrowing. He needs bypass surgery. The procedure is routine now, performed thousands of times every day. But he's 81. There are risks. August 7, 2012. The surgery happens. It goes well. He recovers in the ICU. Everything seems fine. Then complications develop. The details remain sealed under legal settlement. But something goes wrong with post-operative care. An infection or improper removal of temporary pacing wires or some combination of failures, Armstrong's condition deteriorates. August 25, 2012. Neil Armstrong dies. He's 82 years and 20 days old. 43 years after walking on the moon. The world mourns. President Obama issues a statement calling him among the greatest of American heroes, not just of his time, but of all time. NASA releases tributes. Astronauts and engineers and people who never met him share their grief. Michael Collins says Armstrong was the best pilot he ever knew, and one of the best men. Buzz Aldrin, with whom Armstrong had a complicated relationship marked by professional respect and personal distance, praises his commander's skill and courage. But the most telling response comes from the Armstrong family. They release a statement that includes this paragraph. For those who may ask what they can do to honor Neil, we have a simple request. Honor his example of service, accomplishment and modesty, and the next time you walk outside on a clear night and see the moon smiling down at you, think of Neil Armstrong and give him a wink. Give him a wink. That's how they want him remembered, not with monuments or worship. With a wink? An acknowledgement between friends. The family later receives a $6 million settlement from the hospital. The terms are sealed, but the settlement suggests that the complications were preventable, that Neil Armstrong might have survived if the post-operative care had been better. He survived combat, he survived experimental aircraft crashes, he survived the LLRV explosion, he survived Gemini 8 spinning out of control, he survived landing on the moon with seconds of fuel remaining, and he died from complications after routine surgery. The irony is brutal. His ashes are scattered in the Atlantic Ocean. No grave, no monument, just the sea and the sky he spent his life exploring. Now, let's talk about what we got wrong. You know the myth. American boy dreams of flying, works hard, becomes astronaut, lands on moon, national hero, the end. Every part of that is technically true and fundamentally incomplete. Start with the selection. Armstrong didn't become an astronaut because he was the best pilot in America. He became an astronaut because he applied at the right time with the right qualifications and fit NASA's needs. The timing mattered. If Karen hadn't died when she did, would he have applied? If Gemini 8 hadn't failed in exactly the way that let him demonstrate crisis management, would he have commanded Apollo 11? We treat his achievement as inevitable. It wasn't. It was contingent on 1,000 variables, including tragedies and coincidences he never controlled. The landing, everyone knows the fuel was low, 25 seconds remaining when they touched down. Dramatic. But ask any Apollo flight director, and they'll tell you that wasn't actually close to abort criteria. They had fuel margins. Armstrong remained calm because the situation was manageable, not because he was being heroic. We mythologize the danger to make the achievement more impressive. The achievement doesn't need embellishment. Landing on the moon is impressive enough. The quote, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." He insists, he said, for a man. The audio is ambiguous. We'll never know for certain, but we've turned the quote into something sacred when Armstrong himself said he thought about it after landing, not as some prepared philosophical statement. We want the moment to be perfect. We want the first words spoken on another world to be profound and planned. Armstrong gave us what we needed, but we transformed it into more than he intended. The hero's return. This is where the myth completely breaks down. Heroes return home and live happily. Armstrong returned home and spent the rest of his life trying to escape what he'd done. He didn't want the fame. He actively avoided it. He sued people for using his image without permission. He refused most interview requests. He declined opportunities to leverage his celebrity for wealth or influence. The myth says he lived as a happy recluse, content with his achievement. The reality is his first marriage collapsed. He struggled with being treated as a symbol rather than a person. And the single greatest accomplishment in human history became something he couldn't discuss without being mobbed. Ask yourself, if you achieved the most impressive thing any human being had ever done, and then spent the rest of your life unable to talk about it without losing your privacy and autonomy, would that feel like winning? The myth sanitizes suffering. Armstrong's life included real pain, Karen's death, the marriage failing, the burden of fame he never wanted, the frustration of watching America's commitment to space exploration decline, while he, the most famous astronaut alive, couldn't prevent it. We tell the story as triumph because we need heroes. We need to believe that extraordinary achievement leads to happiness. But Armstrong's story suggests something darker. That sometimes the cost of being first is spending the rest of your life defined by that single moment, unable to be anything else. James Hansen's biography, First Man, tried to complicate this narrative. It showed Armstrong as human, complex, flawed in some ways, extraordinary in others. The 2018 film adaptation, with Ryan Gosling, emphasized the emotional cost. Critics complained it was too dark, too focused on Karen's death, not triumphant enough. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real story is more valuable than the myth, because the real story tells us something important about what we ask of our heroes. We asked Armstrong to walk on the moon. He did. But we also asked him to represent humanity, to embody achievement, to be a symbol of what we could accomplish. And we never asked if he wanted that. We never considered what it would cost him. The moon landing happened because thousands of people worked toward a common goal. 400,000 people employed by NASA and contractors, years of research and development, billions of dollars, the collective effort of a nation. But we remember one name. We put the entire weight of that achievement on Armstrong's shoulders. And then we're surprised when he struggles to carry it. There's a photograph from the moon. It's the most famous photograph Armstrong took. It shows Buzz Aldrin standing on the lunar surface in his spacesuit, the Earth visible in the reflection of his helmet visor. Armstrong is not in the photograph. He's behind the camera, the photographer. That's a metaphor for his entire approach to the moon landing. He was there, he did the work. But he preferred to be the observer, not the subject. He wanted to document the achievement, not star in it. We forced him to be the star anyway, because we needed him to be, because the story requires a protagonist, and he was commander, and that made him the protagonist whether he wanted the role or not. Here's what we should have learned from Neil Armstrong, and didn't. Excellence doesn't require glory-seeking. Armstrong never grandstanded, never claimed he was better than his colleagues. He did extraordinary things with minimal ego, and the work spoke for itself. Stoicism has costs. Armstrong's emotional control saved lives during Gemini 8. It made him perfect for Apollo 11. But it also contributed to the isolation that damaged his relationships. The same trait that made him an exceptional astronaut made him difficult to live with. Fame is not the same as success. Armstrong succeeded at everything he attempted professionally. But the fame that resulted from Apollo 11 was not something he achieved. It was something inflicted on him. And it made the rest of his life harder, not easier. Collective achievements need symbolic individuals, but that's unfair to the individual. Armstrong represented Apollo, but Apollo was 400,000 people. Putting all that symbolic weight on one person is convenient for storytelling and brutal for the person carrying it. Privacy is worth protecting. Armstrong spent decades fighting for the right to live quietly. He was criticized for this, called ungrateful, reclusive, cold. But wanting privacy after becoming the most famous person on Earth is not ungrateful. It's human. We should have let him have it. Now ask yourself the uncomfortable question, did we benefit from Armstrong's achievement more than he did? You can look at the moon tonight and feel wonder because Armstrong walked there. The achievement inspires. It proves humans can do impossible things. It expands our sense of what's achievable. Armstrong got to experience 21 hours on the lunar surface and then spent 43 years being Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon, unable to be anything else. You got inspiration. He got a cage. That's not to say he regretted Apollo 11. Every indication suggests he considered the moon landing the privilege of his life. But privilege and burden aren't mutually exclusive. It can be both the greatest thing that ever happened to you and the thing that makes the rest of your life harder. The full weight of this becomes clear when you look at what happened to the other Apollo astronauts. Buzz Aldrin struggled with depression and alcoholism after returning from the moon. He wrote about it openly, described the difficulty of returning to ordinary life after walking on another world. Many Apollo astronauts divorced. Several struggled with the transition back to normal careers. Going to the moon was the peak. Everything after was descent. Armstrong handled it better than most in the sense that he maintained stability and found meaningful work. But better than most still meant decades of discomfort with fame, a failed marriage, and increasing isolation. The Apollo astronauts were test pilots and engineers turned into mythological figures. They signed up to fly spacecraft, not to become symbols. And the psychological toll of that transformation is something we still don't fully acknowledge. If we were honest about this, we'd admit that we used these men for our national mythology and didn't care much about what it cost them personally. We got our heroes. They got to deal with the consequences. Armstrong understood this. That's why he withdrew. He gave us Apollo 11. He gave us the moon landing, but he refused to give us the rest of his life. He maintained boundaries. He protected what he could, and we resented him for it. Think about that. We resented the first human being to walk on another world for wanting privacy. We complained that he didn't do enough interviews, didn't make enough appearances, didn't satisfy our need to celebrate him. The entitlement is staggering when you state it plainly. Armstrong owed us nothing beyond doing his job, which he did perfectly. The moon landing succeeded, the samples returned, the mission was flawless. Everything else, every interview and appearance and speech, was extra. Optional, a gift, not an obligation, but we treated it as obligation. And when he declined, we called him cold. Here's the thing about Armstrong that the myth obscures. He was probably right to be the way he was. The test pilot mentality, the emotional control, the focus on systems and procedures over feelings, these traits enabled him to survive situations that would have killed almost anyone else. Gemini 8 starts spinning out of control. Most people panic. Armstrong runs diagnostics and solves the problem while approaching unconsciousness. The LLRV explodes beneath him. He ejects, lands safely, goes back to work. The moon landing site is covered in boulders. He takes manual control and finds a clear spot with seconds of fuel remaining. These aren't accidents. This is the result of training and personality aligning perfectly with requirements. Armstrong was built for this. The same emotional distance that made him difficult to know made him perfect for crisis. So when we criticize his coldness, we're criticizing the exact trait that enabled his achievement. We want him to be warm and accessible, and also the person who can land on the moon when everything goes wrong. But you don't get both. The psychological profile that creates exceptional test pilots doesn't create people who open up easily about feelings. Janet Armstrong said in later interviews that she knew who she was marrying. She understood he was a test pilot, that the work was dangerous, that he approached life through an engineering lens. But she didn't anticipate fame. Nobody did. And fame magnified every difficult trait he had while adding new pressures neither of them expected. Karen's death probably worsened this. Grief doesn't have a required expression. Some people talk, some people cry, some people compartmentalize and function and never process the loss in ways that look normal to others. Armstrong appears to have been the third type. The grief went somewhere internal and stayed there. He played sad music on the piano. That was his expression. Everything else remained sealed. Did this damage him? Probably. Did it damage his relationships? Definitely. But we don't know what alternatives he had. If talking about Karen would have helped, great. But some people genuinely process grief through silence and work. Insisting everyone grieve the same way is another form of not seeing people as they actually are. The authorized biography reveals moments of warmth. He played with his sons. He had a sense of humor, dry and understated. He cared about students. He engaged seriously with engineering problems. He was capable of connection, but connection required trust. And being Neil Armstrong made trust nearly impossible. How do you know if someone wants to know you or wants to know the first man on the moon? How do you form genuine relationships when fame precedes you into every interaction? Armstrong solved this by limiting interactions. He kept small circles of trusted people. He avoided situations where his celebrity would overwhelm everything else. This looks like coldness if you're outside the circle. From inside, it was probably self-preservation. Carol, his second wife, seemed to understand this. Their marriage lasted 18 years until his death. No public drama, no tell-all interviews afterward. She gave him what he needed, companionship without spectacle. Maybe that's the real love story. Not the first marriage that collapsed under pressure, but the second marriage that succeeded because both people understood what they needed and could provide it for each other. But we don't tell that story because it's not dramatic enough. We want the epic romance. We want the childhood sweetheart who stands by her man through everything. When the reality is more complicated, we lose interest. The same thing happens with Armstrong's entire life. We want the simple story. Farm boy becomes astronaut, becomes hero. When the reality includes depression, divorce, isolation, and a man who achieved everything and still seemed quietly sad, we don't know what to do with that. So we simplify, we sand off the rough edges, we make him the hero the myth requires instead of the human being he was. And in doing that, we miss the real lesson. The lesson is not that hard work and determination lead to triumph. Armstrong's story isn't a self-help book. The lesson is that extraordinary achievement comes with extraordinary costs, and we're not honest about those costs when we celebrate the achievement. If you want to be Armstrong, you need to be willing to lose a daughter and never fully process the grief. You need to be willing to risk your life repeatedly in experimental aircraft and combat missions and spacecraft that might explode. You need to be willing to sacrifice emotional intimacy for professional excellence. You need to be willing to achieve the greatest thing any human has ever done and then spend the rest of your life unable to escape it. That's the actual price. Not the sanitized version we teach school children. The real cost. And knowing that cost, would you still want it? Armstrong apparently thought it was worth it. He never expressed regret about Apollo. He advocated for continued space exploration until he died. Whatever the personal toll, he believed the mission mattered, but he also showed us through his actions, if not his words, that hero worship is a burden, that fame can be a trap, that achieving your ultimate goal at 38 means figuring out what to do with the next 44 years of your life. The world needed Neil Armstrong to walk on the moon. The question nobody asked is, what did Neil Armstrong need? Maybe he needed to grieve his daughter properly. Maybe he needed a career that challenged him after Apollo without the weight of being a symbol. Maybe he needed people to see him as an engineer who happened to go to the moon instead of as the moon landing personified. He got none of those things. He got fame and expectation and people wanting pieces of him until there was nothing left to give. The hospital settlement haunts me, not because of the money, because the greatest test pilot of his generation, who survived everything, died from preventable complications after routine surgery. It feels wrong, like the universe owes him better. He walked on the moon and returned safely from that impossible journey, but a hospital in Cincinnati killed him with what should have been standard care. There's no meaning in that, no poetry, just random failure at the worst possible time. Armstrong would probably have appreciated the irony. He understood systems and failure modes. He knew that procedures matter, that small mistakes compound, that you can do everything right and still lose if one component fails. That's what killed him. Not heroic sacrifice, not going down fighting, just a cascade of small failures in post-operative care that his 82-year-old body couldn't overcome. It's the most human ending possible for a man we tried to make superhuman. He died the way most people die, old in a hospital from complications. The moon landing didn't make him immortal, it just made him famous. And in the end, those are very different things. So where does this leave us? You know more now than when you started. You know Armstrong was more complicated than the myth, that his achievement cost him more than the myth acknowledges, that the story we tell ourselves about Apollo 11 is incomplete in ways that matter. But you also know that the achievement was real, that a human being did walk on the moon, that the engineering and courage and skill required were exactly as extraordinary as the myth claims. Both things are true. The achievement is real and the cost was real. The mission was perfect and the aftermath was painful. Armstrong was an exceptional pilot and a difficult husband. He accomplished the impossible and struggled with the consequences. History is not simple. People are not simple. And when we simplify them to make the story cleaner, we lose the truth. The truth is that Neil Armstrong was a test pilot from Ohio who flew experimental aircraft and got selected as an astronaut, partly because of rotation, and partly because he was uniquely qualified, and partly because his civilian status served NASA's political needs. He lost his daughter and kept flying. He nearly died in Gemini 8 and came back. He survived the LLRV crash and kept training. And when it mattered most, when the moon landing came down to the final 90 seconds and everything depended on manual control, he was exactly the right person in exactly the right place. That's skill and preparation and talent, but it's also luck. Good luck in survival, bad luck in fame's consequences. He walked on the moon. 600 million people watched. And then he had to figure out how to live the rest of his life as the man who walked on the moon, which is not the same thing as being the man who walked on the moon. If you take anything from this, take this. Achievement and happiness are not the same thing. You can accomplish extraordinary things and still struggle. You can be the best at what you do and still be broken in other ways. Excellence in one domain doesn't transfer to all domains. Armstrong was the perfect test pilot, the perfect astronaut, the perfect commander for Apollo 11. But he was not perfect at being famous, not perfect at being a husband, not perfect at processing grief. He was human, exceptionally skilled in specific ways, limited in others, exactly like everyone else except for that one thing he did that nobody else has matched. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need Armstrong to be a perfect hero. Maybe knowing he was a complicated human being who did something impossible makes the achievement more impressive, not less. Because perfect heroes don't inspire. They intimidate. They set standards nobody can meet. But complicated humans who accomplish extraordinary things, that's useful. That suggests the rest of us might be capable of more than we think. Not moon landings necessarily, but our version of impossible things, the things we're uniquely positioned to attempt because of our specific combination of skills and circumstances and timing. Armstrong had his moment. It lasted 21 hours on the lunar surface and defined the rest of his life. Your moment will be different. Probably smaller. Definitely different. But the pattern is the same. Prepare. Work. Accept risk. And when the moment comes, when everything depends on you making the right decision in impossible circumstances, you'll either have what it takes or you won't. Armstrong had it. When Gemini 8 spun out of control, when the LLRV exploded, when the moon landing site was covered in boulders, every time he had what the moment required. That's not luck. That's decades of preparation meeting opportunity. That's the farm boy who learned to fly at 16, who survived Korea, who flew the X-15, who trained until the responses were automatic. And when it mattered, the preparation paid off. Whatever you're preparing for, that's the model, not the fame or the mythology. The preparation, the work, the willingness to keep going when the LLRV explodes beneath you and you still have to fly the mission. Armstrong walked on the moon, but before that, he flew 900 test flights and 78 combat missions and survived more emergencies than most pilots will ever face. The moon landing was the culmination, but the preparation was the foundation. Build your foundation, do the work, and when your moment comes, maybe you'll have what it takes. Armstrong did, and it cost him more than he expected, but he never said it wasn't worth it. That's the final lesson. The cost is real, the achievement is real, and you can't have one without the other. Choose accordingly. The next time you see the moon, give him that wink, the one his family requested, because Neil Armstrong walked there. And then spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of being the first. He earned the wink. And maybe, if you look carefully at that grey and cratered surface, you can still see the footprints. Still there after 50-some years, still there after he's gone. The moon remembers, even if Armstrong spent his life trying to forget.